everybody, and welcome to the presentation about online censorship and security impact. Today I would like to discuss the history of online censorship. I would like to give you a brief overview of different censorship techniques, different goals for censorship, and analyze and try to categorize censorship online. We will also take a look at a couple of case studies, and we will end with recommendations for how to best implement censorship where it's required so as not to limit legitimate use cases online. Now, for this presentation, I took one of the academic definitions of censorship online. That's a definition that equates censorship with filtering or blocking. So throughout this presentation, these terms mean the same thing. That's basically control of information that is considered undesirable. The goal of a censor, that is a party censoring information, is to disrupt free flow of information. And in this case, it doesn't really matter if the censor is a state censor or it's a private censor, or for example, it's a parent trying to protect their children from bad influence online. According to the academic definition, all these are types of censors. So the goal of a censor is to disrupt free flow of information, stop the publication of information, prevent access to information, or directly prevent user from accessing information. Those are the three generic types how a censor can disrupt the free flow of information. We are talking about online censorship here today. I don't know how many of you remember, but back in the beginnings of the internet, basically for the first 20, maybe 25 years since creation of ARPANET, which is predecessor of the modern internet, internet had nothing to do with reality. Internet was this separate space and no one took it seriously. Therefore, it was not important to control information on there. For the younger generation in the audience, I could do a comparison with video games, where you can chat in video games and no one really cares what you type in there. It's not like you can do any of the. It's not like you can cause any of the problems that censors are looking at there. But then again, nowadays, even video games are being considered by censors as possible platforms of insurgents and possible places where censorship should or might happen. Censorship in history always begins with the library. 2000 years before Christ, there was a burning of a library in China, which is one of the first practical cases of censorship recorded in history. In 1969, ARPANET was created. That is the predecessor of the modern internet. 21 years later, Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web. Same year, filtering in libraries in the United States began. Filtering of online content was limited to only libraries, and there were good reasons. But even back then, even in 1990, there were libraries who joined on the side with the censors, and there were some libraries standing out and saying, our goal is to provide free access to information, and we are not going to be censored. A bit more into the future, in 1998, the Great Firewall of China was created. And we're going to take a look at China when we get to the country studies later on. To classify censorship, academic authors give us 5 different motivations, 5 different censorship goals. And I've added the 6th one at the bottom. So let's go through all of them. One of the reasons is politics and power, which I name P in this presentation throughout. And this is usually according to the political agenda of the ruling party or the tyrant that rules the country. So basically, this is usually used to squash any opposition attempts, any risks to changing the rule of the country to a different party or different power. And in this presentation will mean social norms and morals, which includes censorship for pornography, censorship for content that relates to non-traditional sexual orientations, gambling, hate speech. And here I have to draw a fine line. If gambling is being censored as a whole because it's not morally correct according to the society or according to the ruler of the country, then it goes under category N. If on the other side is being censored for some other reason, then it may go under E or B. S for security, which is dealing with terrorism, insurgency, and IT threats. So, for example, even if CERT would look to block communication between two endpoints because malware is being distributed between them, formally, according to academic definitions, is still censorship. Economic interests usually relate to limiting access to foreign service providers to boost countries' own level of economy. Business goals relate to individual parties operating inside the economy. And examples here include protection of intellectual property rights and preferential treatment of content providers. For example, if a content provider, say Netflix, arranges with the local internet service provider that their traffic will be prioritized or offered for free to the customers, traffic-wise, for free, then it is category B censorship. And finally, F for enforcement. It's a new category, and it talks about limiting ways to work around censorship, because if you look at these 5 categories, there will be ways to get around them, and currently what we're looking at online is more and more countries are trying to find ways to censor more traffic because it's being used to work around censorship for one of the 5 main motivations. And that is where we see the most collateral damage. So where does online censorship actually happen? Here is a generic scheme of how communication on the internet happens. We see the content on your left, then there's a server that hosts the content, and the data center that provides server access to the internet. Local internet exchanges are labeled L1 and L2. That is where the different national providers of the country interconnect. And global internet exchanges, or rather network of global internet exchanges, is labeled G. That is where all the different countries and all the different providers of different countries interconnect. From the right side, there's a user. We have their machine, and we have their internet service provider, which is labeled P. So this is the generic scheme of how communication online happens. And each of these points is vulnerable to censorship. Let's take a look. So for this presentation, I create 7 censorship types, labeled 1 through 7, depending on where censorship takes place. I will refer to them throughout the presentation. So 1, meaning censorship happens at the content level, meaning that the author or manager of the content self-censors. 7, for example, means that user self-censors, which is a it's a non-technical type of censorship, but it's a very, very dangerous type of censorship. It's so-called chilling effect, where the user fears punishment or fears non-approval by the society and self-censors themselves. So different censorship methods, depending on where they are employed, are the following. Endpoint malware can be used either at the content end or at user's machine end. And some countries actually use that to extort censorship, to enforce censorship upon people. One example here is a special version of Skype that is made for China. It's called Tom Skype. It is considered endpoint malware of type 6 because it runs on the user machine and it automatically monitors for specific keywords. This allows sending those messages and also notifies the authorities that you're sending the message. Transit degradation is happening either in the data center or local internet exchanges or the provider of the user, internet provider of the user. And this method is quite hard to detect, and it is used by countries that do not want to face the consequences of outright censoring some content. What transit degradation means is that your internet speeds for specific kind of traffic are lowered so low that it becomes almost impossible to use the resource. I already mentioned self-censorship, which happens either the content side or the user side, also called chilling effect. Content manipulation means replacing some or all of the content with different content that censor approves. It of course happens at the content side. It can also happen on the server where the content is stored. And some countries also use internet service providers of the user to manipulate the traffic and change the content this way. Then there is routing corruption and corruption of other protocols. And this basically applies to the network part of the scheme. You will also notice, if you go to the previous slide, that there is this green rectangle that's called net neutrality. This is the zone that net neutrality talks about. Net neutrality is a principle that specifies that you shall not differentiate service level provider depending on the content of the traffic, meaning that if machine M would send data in and machine S, the server, would want to receive it, data should go through regardless of what words are there in the data, and it should go through with the same speed. So net neutrality applies to these nodes inside the green rectangle. And that is also where corruption of protocols happens. So what concerns does censorship cause? We can be dealing with intentional abuse of power, where a censor intentionally censors something that is not allowed according to current regulation. We can take a look at mistakes when creating a block list, which means that censor unintentionally censors something. Policy change can lead to reusing existing capability for other goals, which is what we see in Latvia right now. And finally, enforcement slippery slope is a huge problem. It usually ends with banning entire types of services, for example, virtual private networks, or disconnecting the country from internet altogether, as we will see in some examples. Now, we will mention circumvention briefly in the presentation, so for you to understand how it works, here's the general graphic. So you have your machine, country does deep packet inspection, and it tries to determine if it should block your connection or not. And you can use a proxy network of some kind, it's a generic term here, outside your national networks to work around the censorship. That way, deep packet inspection box will not be able to understand that you're accessing unallowed traffic. Now, this is a global overview of current censorship status. And it's actually here for one reason. It's incomplete. Information globally that's available about different censorship in different countries, especially for small countries, is scarce. For example, many of the countries here are marked green, which means that there is little or none internet censorship and surveillance. But actually, that is not the case in Latvia, for example, and I know that firsthand. And we have to work as an international community to try and get our stories out there so that organizations doing stock taking of how internet freedoms work around the globe can hear us and can have the right data available. So let's quickly take a look at overview of 3 different countries. First of all, China. Internet came to China quite late. It was 1994. first regulation concerning censorship on the internet was adopted 2 years later. 2 more years later, the Great Firewall of China project was started. It's actually part of so-called Golden Shield project, which includes not only technical but also non-technical means to keep the ruling party in control. And, well, basically that's the goal of the Golden Shield project, yes. Now, between 1998 and now, there have been lots and lots of other initiatives and improvements to the censorship network in China. And we don't have time to cover them here. But the recent development was that virtual private networks were finally officially banned in China. There were some complications in them even before this year, but now they're officially banned. Now, as far as we know, China employs a type 3 censorship network, meaning that they employ censorship at local internet exchanges, so at the borders of their country, inside their country. And the goals that we can gather from the research available online is that they use it for politics and power reasons, they use it for social norms and morals, and they use it for enforcement, as we can see by internet by VPNs being also censored. And they are unique in a way because they use a deeper inspection than deep packet inspection, if we can so say. They use active probing. On the right, you see, for example, how they detect Tor bridges or entry nodes. They actively probe and try to communicate with the suspect server and try to understand if it is a device that is used to avoid censorship or it's not. So that's our current challenge. They're battling enforcement. The second country I'd like to talk about is Russia. Now, internet saw an increase in number of users more than threefold between 2004 and 2008 in Russia. And 4 years later, 2012, internet blacklist law was adopted in Russia. We will talk about some results of the internet blacklist law in Russia. But in 2017, which is this year, same as China, VPNs are officially banned in Russia. So are we looking at a new global trend? I certainly hope not. They employ different kinds of censorship. They censor at server levels. They also censor at provider levels. And I believe that the important part of censorship online in Russia is censoring at the user level. So creating the chilling effect so that people will not talk freely online. And they censor for all of the goals that we outlined in the classification before. We can actually take a look at some of the addresses banned, some of the mails, some of the files banned, and we can find all of these reasons why Russia is censoring their internet. For example, here's a slide that I found in the blacklist for Russia. I don't know what the presentation is about, but I would imagine it's a legitimate presentation about medical issues, and it's banned because it includes a description of how a person could commit suicide. Well, lots of interesting things happen in Russia. So, as you can see, these are some news headlines. Russia has blocked access to internet pages promoting the Moscow protest. It happened a while ago. Russia has also blocked Google, and it wasn't a mistake. They blocked it intentionally to get Google to comply with their censorship. And finally, an interesting case that happened this year is how hackers undermined Russian attempts to control the internet. When we access a web page, we basically type in a name, for example, possible.lv, and there's a server that has an address, an IP address. And when you blacklist by the domain name, that means an attacker who has his web page blacklisted can change the IP address to some other IP address that is innocuous, thus blocking the other sites. And that is what hackers did. They actually blocked a lot of government sites by taking their own blocked web pages and changing the IP address to the government web pages. And now Russia has implemented a whitelist, meaning list of IP addresses that can never be blocked. Now for Latvia. It turns out that very little information is available internationally about Latvia. So I will talk about Latvia a bit longer than the other two countries. Fortunately, I've seen all the process from the very beginning with my own eyes, and that's why I want to contribute to the international debate on censorship and contribute to the story of Latvia with this part of the presentation. So in 2013, a secretive, closed, and very fast, unnecessarily fast, in my opinion, process led to changes in electronic communications law. So paragraph 13 prim was created, and it allowed lotteries and gambling supervision inspection to order internet service providers to block gambling sites. This is, of course, censorship for economic interest reasons, because we, as a community, which is represented by our government, do not want gambling that doesn't pay taxes to Latvia to happen in Latvia. And it's being implemented at internet service provider levels on the user side. So it's type 5 gambling. Only 2 internet service providers have properly implemented the blocking mechanism. Others have implemented either too strict or too broad blocking, which results to lots of collateral damage that's happening right now, or it results in connections just going through. And we can actually access the list of blocked domains and IP addresses here on the right. Now, after 2013, a lot of commotion and intent at all decision-making levels happened, and politicians and different ministries and different servicemen looked and advertised and lobbied for using the censorship system for other reasons. So currently it's economic interests, right? For example, one party used the podium in the parliament to talk about censoring all content coming from one of our neighboring countries using the system. Finally, in 2015, Ministry of Culture wanted to reuse the same type 5 censorship for enforcing copyright for audiovisual works. Civil society, which I was a part of, stood their ground, and we managed to get an open discussion. We managed to prolong the discussion because they wanted to use the same discussion, non-discussion policy that was used to create the first censorship. And we managed to spend a good year discussing the best way to do it. So it ended in changes to electronic mass media law, and it's type 1, type 2 censorship, which is much better because it actually talks about working with the content providers and removing the content there, or if they don't comply, using the servers or the data centers to block access. And this is censorship for business goals because it talks about profit of companies that are the content providers. In 2016, a process that was almost as bad as is back in 2013, we got the changes to law on taxes and duties that allows to block sites on ground of tax evasion as well as minor infractions. And it was hard for me to classify it correctly. It's either economic interests or it's politics and power. Because while tax evasion is economic interest, minor infractions like not submitting a formal report on time, leading to blocking, is hard to classify as an economic interest. And this is type 1, 2, and 3 blocking. Type 3 blocking, in comparison with the Ministry of Culture, is added because they also have the ability to block Latvian domain name directly. Now, it's stated that the error rate for blocking in Latvia is approximately 1 error per year. And here are the 3 errors that have been published so far on the internet. Page of mathematician James Grime was blocked, unintentionally apparently. VMware knowledge database was blocked unintentionally, and Reddit forums were blocked, also apparently unintentionally. Here we can see a tweet that says, it's ironic that mathematical education that could help people to understand that gambling leads to loss of money is being blocked because of gambling. This address that belongs to James Grime, that, well, James Grime block uses, is actually still blocked. I checked it yesterday, and some service providers still block this site. It's been blocked for almost 2 years. Therefore, well, this address, as you can see, it hosts 150,000 different web pages, and many of them legitimate web pages. We can conclude here that the IP list, official IP list of blocked IP addresses is append only, because you can see that they actually appended a new IP address 3 months later, but they never removed it. So there's no mechanism to clear the blacklist. The question is why. And we can actually see that the IP address for the gambling site itself, as we can see on the bottom right corner, has already changed. And it's not in there. So apparently capacity is lacking and proper technical assistance is lacking for the gambling inspection to manage that. Of course, I have to mention the SS.com case, which happened just recently when State Revenue Service tried to exercise their new right. We will, I think, still see outfall of that case further down the line. Shortly, 2 individual case studies that didn't warrant talking about countries as a whole, but are different types of censorship that we should take a look at and you should be aware of. Ethiopia has a tradition of shutting down internet in the whole country. Sometimes top hotels still have some kind of connection, but other than that, whole country is being shut down to beat students cheating at exams. So apparently people there do not see the balance correctly between cheating at exams and the economic growth that internet access can bring to the country. Just recently, Catalonia independence referendum was sabotaged by the Spanish government. That's another type of censorship. That's politics and power for sure, and this is dangerous. And I'm not weighing in here on if the referendum was good or not. But as an internet activist, I can say that this is a very dangerous trend. Now, coming to the conclusion of the presentation, I have outlined some security consequences, some negative ones and some positive ones of censorship online. And finally, we have some recommendations. Censorship erodes trust in integrity of available information, especially when we are talking about manipulation with content. Therefore, users don't trust what they see on the internet anymore. The chilling effect on end users and publishers leads to them not speaking up against illegal activities by the censor. For example, if there is some corruption in the government, they will not speak up against it if they know that they will be censored or punished. Banning virtual private networks leads to lower availability of encryption services, meaning that I use VPNs in cafes. When I sit and use their Wi-Fi, I connect to a VPN to get an encrypted connection. And if VPNs are banned in the country, I cannot do that anymore, even though my use of VPN is not to avoid censorship. So we have collateral damage there. Internet shutdown, global internet shutdown leads to no communication even in an emergency, which is a safety threat. Finally, if we talk about wartime scenario, censorship system, if overtaken by the enemy, can be used to paralyze legitimate traffic. So it's problematic if large centralized censorship system exists there to be taken over. Now for the positive consequences. Censorship allows for quick reaction to IT threats. For example, if malware is spreading, it is paramount that authorities can block some types of traffic to stop it from spreading quickly. It allows enforcing global regulations and moral norms, and those norms that are morally understood globally as many countries, as a community of many countries together. For example, blocking of child abuse imagery is acceptable, and it's also easy to implement. Again, for wartime, it can be used, censorship can be used to resist enemy propaganda, which is also a good thing, of course. Now, finally, recommendations. How do you find the balance between censoring or not censoring content? While doing this research, I came to this conclusion. We can censor, and we should censor for moral reasons at the content provider level and at the server level. So if we have child abuse imagery, that's where we go to, and that's what we actually do as a global community. For security reasons, we can censor anywhere except on the user machine and inside the user's head. We should not censor for these two reasons. Sorry, we should not censor for other reasons, and we shouldn't censor in user machine and in user's head for any reasons. It is okay if we censor on ad hoc and case-by-case basis, but if we implement a centralized dragnet censorship system, as most countries, including Latvia, do, it creates many problems and it creates a lot of possible risks. So that was my overview on censorship globally and censorship in Latvia. And if there is time for a question or two, I'd be happy to answer. So thank you very much.